Hi guys. In this presentation, we're going to be discussing the first chapter of white privilege, the matter of whiteness. In the first chapter of white privilege, we're basically exploring the invisibility of whiteness. White people aren't really forced to consider race. We generally don't feel affected by it on a daily basis, but race essentially runs the world. It determines life on every level, from how you're treated by staff when you're shopping in a store, to who gets access to housing, education, and healthcare. We tend to focus study on the imagery of people of color, but we sometimes forget to dig into how white people are represented and what it means to be white. Comedies with black actors are black comedies, while comedies starring white people are just comedies. White history is treated as the history, and black history or Chinese history is just an addition onto regular history. Race is only applied in this way to non-white people. While people of color are raced, white people just get to be people. We are treated as the norm, while people of color are other. Non-whites don't have the luxury of ignoring their race and the status that it affords them, but white people are often oblivious to their own whiteness. It's very dangerous to treat whiteness as a standard, and we do it all the time. For example, there's no explicit description in the Harry Potter books that describe Hermione Granger as being white, but unless otherwise stated, we're probably going to assume whiteness. It's not always malicious or intentional, but it does contribute to our silent acceptance of the unfair advantages that whiteness provides. One really glaring example of the white standard is in the design of women's bras and panties. Nude bras are a light tan, peachy color. They're nude in that they blend in with the skin color of white women. This color is the standard for nude. It's the baseline, implied to be nude for everyone. Anything else is specialty or other. It's the same with Band-Aids and even some brands of makeup foundation. Anything that's skin-colored is made to accommodate the color of white skin. Part 1 as a whole delves deeper into the meaning of whiteness and why it's so uncomfortable for us as white people to acknowledge our privilege. Because white people don't really have to think about themselves in racial terms, it makes it hard for people to understand why it's such an issue to people of color. I hear a lot, why does it have to be about race? White people don't understand that they're bringing their own whiteness into all of these situations that are criticized for focusing too heavily on race. They just don't see whiteness because of its invisibility in our culture, at least for white people. People of color have to see whiteness, and sometimes it's not in the positive way that white people would have themselves be seen. One point that the book noted was the age-old argument of, well, I didn't own any slaves, so how is this my fault? We need to realize that even if we weren't personally responsible for slavery or the genocide of Native Americans, we still benefit from the lasting products of these acts. We benefit from white supremacy in general. It isn't about making white people feel guilty. I think that's a big part that gets lost in translation when you're trying to have a discussion on race or privilege. Talking about race, accepting your whiteness, and the privilege that it gives you is seen as an attack on white people or reverse racism. More attention needs to be paid to understanding and deconstructing white privilege than just becoming immediately offended at the thought of benefiting from racism or being called out on racist behavior or attitudes. Even the reading discussed how it's almost impossible to grow up in America as a white person without some sort of bias or prejudice. Racism can be unintentional and unconscious. In fact, most of it is. And if we can't see it ourselves, we have to know that it's in our best interest to keep the dialogue open and to acknowledge others' suffering. We have to believe people of color when they tell us that we're being problematic or that there's systemic problems that they encounter that we don't. We need to work on bettering ourselves and fixing our racism rather than sulking over hurt feelings. No one likes to think of themselves as racist, and no one likes to feel as if their own struggles are diminished on account of their race. It's understandable why acknowledging one's own biases it's uncomfortable. But this is necessary in order to make whiteness visible. If you don't recognize that some of your success as a white person could have stemmed from white privilege, if you subscribe to this belief that all it truly takes to be successful is hard work, then you're unintentionally saying that all of this pervasive inequality is the result of personal failings on the part of people of color, rather than just accepting the possibility that the game might be somewhat rigged in the favor of the dominant group. The chapter brought up a lot of really important information that I think all of us can incorporate into our lives. Once you start noticing the ways that you're benefiting from white privilege, you can do more to counteract it, and you can use your privilege to help raise others up. Even if it's something as simple as waiting for another elevator to avoid riding with a black person, which is the example they used in the book. Once you notice this prejudice, you can change your behavior, and in doing so, you might even be able to help other people notice theirs. Personally, I'm very privileged, but even though I try to be aware of it, it's really, really easy to take whiteness for granted. I thought the book did a really good job of explaining white privilege in a way that didn't immediately turn white people off to the message. Privilege is still dangerous and sinister, but I felt like what the chapter was essentially saying was, this is how it is. Let's not throw a pity party for ourselves and our white guilt. Let's just try to fix this. Ultimately, it's the power of education. The whole point of my chapter was to explain how whiteness is invisible, so you can understand how difficult it is to recognize when you're doing something problematic until it's pointed out to you by someone who's looking at it from a new perspective. Becoming aware that privilege exists is the first step in the process of working toward equality. But I think it's important to note, too, that simply acknowledging that you benefit isn't enough. I've seen the phrase, white silence is violence, and I think that's really poignant and powerful. There are certain aspects of your privilege as a white person that you can't really help. But if you aren't using your status to lift up other people's voices, then you're just knowingly kicking back and enabling the process to continue on as it is now. White privilege is such a massive issue, and it'll take so much progress to overturn. It's going to take everyone working together for us to even make a dent in the problem. For those of us in this class, it's a perfect time to come across this type of material and to start exploring privilege and the struggles of people of color, especially with the current political climate being as it is. One of the obvious efforts going on right now is Black Lives Matter, and I'm sure you guys have all heard of it. Part 1 even mentions specifically the case of Trayvon Martin. who was sort of the catalyst for the movement as it stands now. I believe that's where the hashtag originated from, actually. Anyway, the book discusses how Black bodies are essentially marked from the beginning with targets. They're perceived as being worth less than white bodies and are therefore more acceptable to kill. This reality is what Black Lives Matter is trying to bring attention to. When you understand white privilege, you understand how opposing movements like All Lives Matter play into institutional racism. Like Part 1 explains, this false image of equality or a colorblind society only serves to mask the institutional racism that grips the core of our society. Saying that there is no color or that you magically don't see it is just saying that you're pretending as if everyone is white. If white people represent people, and Black people are the ones consistently reporting that there is a problem, then to white people, who may unintentionally view themselves as being the norm, there isn't a problem at all. Like I said, if white silence is violence, then it's up to all of us to empower those who are left without a voice. People like us who are being educated on these issues, who are curious and eager to help, it's so important to do whatever we can. The chapter makes it really clear that in order to fully address racism, we have to come at it from all sides. We have to look at the white as well as the non-white. It doesn't help anyone to ignore our whiteness and our privilege, just like it doesn't help anyone to pretend not to see color at all or to minimize the power that color holds in our society. Colorblindness is a form of racism, not a solution to it. I think the intersectionality of disadvantage was another really important point that we all have to understand in order to start campaigning for social change. The best way that I can think to illustrate this is through the concept of white versus intersectional feminism. White people can be disadvantaged. White people can be lower class or financially disadvantaged. White LGBT people face discrimination. Feminists work to raise women up to equality with men, and yes, of course, that's a good thing. Men have privilege over women. Even white women are disadvantaged in that respect. But with white-centric feminism, we aren't taking into account that, for example, while white women make X amount less than men, the gap is even wider for women of color. It's important to understand that while you can be individually disadvantaged as a white person, we still benefit collectively and as individuals from the white dominant structure of our society. And additionally, we have to realize that disadvantage compiles for women and LGBT people of color. Recognizing that disadvantage affects different groups in different ways helps to create change that reaches everyone. That's why recognizing white privilege is so important. But we have to always try to be conscious of our motives for challenging privilege too. I liked how they mentioned how modern multiculturalism has really opened up a space for diversity, but it may also function as, quote, a sideshow for white people who look on with delight at all the differences that surround them. Diversity for the sake of white people feeling better about themselves isn't what we need. We aren't, or at least we shouldn't be, working for diversity just to be perceived as non-racist or enlightened, or because it might boost ratings. We all need to acknowledge our privilege, but not because of how it will make us look. We need to strive for equality simply because it's right.